Section 3 of the Scarlet Plague. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by James Christopher. The Scarlet Plague by Jack London. Section 3. The old man wiped the tears away on his grimy knuckles and took up the tale in a tremulous piping voice that soon strengthened as he got the swing of the narrative. It was in the summer of 2013 that the plague came. I was 27 years old, and well do I remember it. Wireless dispatches. Harelip spat loudly his disgust, and Granser hastened to make amends. We talked through the air in those days, thousands and thousands of miles, and the word came of a strange disease that had broken out in New York. There were 17 millions of people living then in that noblest city of America. Nobody thought anything about the news. It was only a small thing. There had been only a few deaths. It seemed, though, that they had died very quickly, and that one of the first signs of the disease was the turning red of the face and all the body. Within 24 hours came the report of the first case in Chicago, and on the same day it was made public that London, the greatest city in the world next to Chicago, had been secretly fighting the plague for 2 weeks and censoring the news dispatches. That is, not permitting the word to go forth to the rest of the world that London had the plague. It looked serious, but we in California, like everywhere else, were not alarmed. We were sure that the bacteriologists would find a way to overcome this new germ, just as they had overcome other germs in the past. But the trouble was the astonishing quickness with which this germ destroyed human beings, and the fact that it inevitably killed any human body it entered. No one ever recovered. There was the old Asiatic cholera, when you might eat dinner with a well man in the evening, and the next morning, if you got up early enough, you would see him being hauled by your window in the death cart. But this new plague was quicker than that, much quicker. From the moment of the first signs of it, a man would be dead in an hour. Some lasted for several hours. Many died within 10 or 15 minutes of the appearance of the first signs. The heart began to beat faster, and the heat of the body to increase. Then came the scarlet rash, spreading like wildfire over the face and body. Most persons never noticed the increase in heat and heartbeat, and the first they knew was when the scarlet rash came out. Usually they had convulsions at the time of the appearance of the rash, but these convulsions did not last long and were not very severe. If one lived through them, he became perfectly quiet, and only did he feel a numbness swiftly creeping up his body from the feet. The heels became numb first, then the legs and hips, and when the numbness reached as high as his heart, he died. They did not rave or sleep. Their minds always remained cool and calm up to the moment their hearts numbed and stopped. And another strange thing was the rapidity of decomposition. No sooner was a person dead than the body seemed to fall to pieces, to fly apart, to melt away even as you looked at it. That was one of the reasons the plague spread so rapidly. All the billions of germs in a corpse were so immediately released. And it was because of all this that the bacteriologists had so little chance in fighting the germs. They were killed in their laboratories even as they studied the germ of the Scarlet Death. They were heroes. As fast as they perished, others stepped forth and took their places. It was in London that they first isolated it. The news was telegraphed everywhere. Trask was the name of the man who succeeded in this, but within 30 hours he was dead. Then came the struggle in all the laboratories to find something that would kill the plague germs. All the drugs failed. You see, the problem was to get a drug, or serum, that would kill the germs in the body and not kill the body. They tried to fight it with other germs, to put into the body of a sick man germs that were the enemies of the plague germs. "And you can't see these germ things, Granser," Harelip objected. "And here you gabble, gabble, gabble about them as if they was anything, when they're nothing at all. Anything you can't see ain't, that's what. Fighting things that ain't with things that ain't. They must have all been fools in those days. That's why they croaked. I ain't going to believe in such rot, I tell you that." Granser promptly began to weep, while Edwin hotly took up his defense. "Look here, Harelip, you believe in lots of things you can't see." Harelip shook his head. "You believe in dead men walking about. You ain't never seen one man walk about. I tell you I seen him last winter, when I was wolf hunting with Dad. Well, you always spit when you cross running water, Edwin challenged. That's to keep off bad luck, was Harelip's defense. You believe in bad luck? Sure. And you ain't never seen bad luck, Edwin concluded triumphantly. You're just as bad as Granser and his germs. You believe in what you don't see. Go on, Granser. Harelip, crushed by this metaphysical defeat, remained silent, and the old man went on. Often and often, though this narrative must not be clogged by the details, was Granser's tale interrupted while the boys squabbled amongst themselves. Also amongst themselves, they kept up a constant low-voiced exchange of explanation and conjecture, as they strove to follow the old man into his unknown and vanished world. The Scarlet Death broke out in San Francisco. The first death came on a Monday morning. By Thursday they were dying like flies in Oakland and San Francisco. They died everywhere, in their beds, at their work, walking along the street. It was on Tuesday that I saw my first death, Miss Colburn, one of my students, sitting right there before my eyes in my lecture room. I noticed her face while I was talking. It had suddenly turned scarlet. I ceased speaking and could only look at her, for the first fear of the plague was already on all of us, and we knew that it had come. The young women screamed and ran out of the room. So did the young men run out, all but two. Miss Colburn's convulsions were very mild, and lasted less than a minute. One of the young men fetched her a glass of water. She drank only a little of it, and cried out, "My feet! All sensation has left them." After a minute she said, "I have no feet. I am unaware that I have any feet. And my knees are cold. I can scarcely feel that I have knees." She lay on the floor, a bundle of notebooks under her head, and we could do nothing. The coldness and numbness crept up past her hips to her heart, and when it reached her heart she was dead. In 15 minutes by the clock, I timed it, she was dead. There, on my own classroom, dead. And she was a very beautiful, strong, healthy young woman. And from the first sign of the plague to her death, only 15 minutes elapsed. That will show you how swift was the Scarlet Death. Yet in those few minutes I remained with the dying woman in my classroom, the alarm had spread over the university, and the students by thousands, all of them, had deserted the lecture room and laboratories. When I emerged on my way to make report to the president of the faculty, I found the university deserted. Across the campus were several stragglers hurrying for their homes. 2 of them were running. President Hoag I found in his office, all alone, looking very old and very gray, with a multitude of wrinkles in his face that I had never seen before. At the sight of me, he pulled himself to his feet and tottered away to the inner office, banging the door after him and locking it. You see, he knew I had been exposed, and he was afraid. He shouted to me through the door to go away. I shall never forget my feelings as I walked down the silent corridors and out across that deserted campus. I was not afraid. I had been exposed, and I looked upon myself as already dead. It was not that, but a feeling of awful depression that impressed me. Everything had stopped. It was like the end of the world to me, my world. I had been born within sight and sound of the university. It had been my predestined career. My father had been a professor there before me, and his father before him. For a century and a half had this university, like a splendid machine, been running steadily on. And now, in an instant, it had stopped. It was like seeing the sacred flame die down on some thrice sacred altar. I was shocked, unutterably shocked. When I arrived home my housekeeper screamed as I entered and fled away. And when I rang, I found the housemaid had likewise fled. I investigated. In the kitchen I found the cook on the point of departure. But she screamed too, and in her haste dropped a suitcase of her personal belongings, and ran out of the house and across the grounds, still screaming. I can hear her scream to this day. You see, we did not act this way when ordinary diseases smote us. We were always calm over such things, and sent for the doctors and nurses who knew just what to do. But this was different. It struck so suddenly, and killed so swiftly, and never missed a stroke. When the scarlet rash appeared on a person's face, that person was marked by death. There was never a known case of recovery. I was alone in my big house. As I have told you often before, in those days we could talk with one another over wires or through the air. The telephone bell rang, and I found my brother talking to me. He told me that he was not coming home for fear of catching the plague from me, and that he had taken our 2 sisters to stop at Professor Bacon's home. He advised me to remain where I was, and wait to find out whether or not I had caught the plague. To all of this I agreed, staying in my house for the first time in my life attempting to cook. And the plague did not come out on me. By means of the telephone I could talk with whomever I pleased and get the news. Also there were the newspapers, and I ordered all of them to be thrown up on my door so that I could know what was happening with the rest of the world. New York and Chicago were in chaos, and what happened with them was happening in all the large cities. A third of the New York police were dead. Their chief was also dead, likewise the mayor. All law and order had ceased. The bodies were lying in the streets unburied. All railroads and vessels carrying food and such things into the great city had ceased runnings, and mobs of the hungry poor were pillaging the stores and warehouses. Murder and robbery and drunkenness were everywhere. Already the people had fled from the city by millions. At first the rich, in their private motor cars and dirigibles, and then the great mass of the population, on foot, carrying the plague with them, themselves starving and pillaging the farmers and all the towns and villages on the way. The man who sent this news, the wireless operator, was alone with his instrument on the top of a lofty building. The people remaining in the city, he estimated them at several 100,000, had gone mad from fear and drink, and on all sides of him great fires were raging. He was a hero, that man who stayed by his post, an obscure newspaper man most likely. For 24 hours, he said, no transatlantic airships had arrived, and no more messages were coming from England. He did state, though, that a message from Berlin, that's in Germany, announced that Hofmeyer, a bacteriologist of the Metchnikoff school, had discovered the serum for the plague. That was the last word, to this day, that we of America ever received from Europe. If Hofmeyer discovered the serum, it was too late, or otherwise, long ere this, explorers from Europe would have come looking for us. We can only conclude that what happened in America happened in Europe, and that, at the best, some several score may have survived the Scarlet Death on that whole continent. For 1 day longer the dispatches continued to come from New York. Then they too ceased. The man who had sent them, perched in his lofty building, had either died of the plague or been consumed in the great conflagrations he had described as raging around him. And what had occurred in New York had been duplicated in all the other cities. It was the same in San Francisco, in Oakland and Berkeley. By Thursday the people were dying so rapidly that their corpses could not be handled, and dead bodies lay everywhere. Thursday night the panic outrush for the country began. Imagine, my grandsons, people thicker than the salmon run you have seen on the Sacramento River, pouring out of the cities by millions, madly over the country, in vain attempt to escape the ubiquitous death. You see, they carried the germs with them. Even the airships of the rich, fleeing for the mountain and desert fastness, carried the germs. Hundreds of these airships escaped to Hawaii, and not only did they bring the plague with them, but they found the plague already there before them. This we learned by the dispatches, until all order in San Francisco vanished, and there were no operators left at their post to receive or send. It was amazing, astonishing, this loss of communication with the world. It was exactly as if the world had ceased, been blotted out. For 60 years that world has no longer existed for me. I know there must be such places as New York, Europe, Asia, and Africa, but not one word has been heard of them, not in 60 years. With the coming of the Scarlet Death, the world fell apart, absolutely, irretrievably. 10,000 years of culture and civilization passed in the twinkling of an eye, lapsed like foam. I was telling about the airships of the rich. They carried the plague with them, and no matter where they fled, they died. I never encountered but one survivor of any of them, Mungerson. He was afterwards a Santa Rosan, and he married my eldest daughter. He came into the tribe 8 years after the plague. He was then 19 years old, and he was compelled to wait 12 years before he could marry. You see, there were no unmarried women. and some of the older daughters of the Santa Rosans were already bespoken. So he was forced to wait until my Mary had grown to 16 years. It was his son, Gimpleg, who was killed last year by the mountain lion. Mungerson was 11 years old at the time of the plague. His father was one of the industrial magnates, a very wealthy, powerful man. It was on his airship, the Condor, that they were fleeing, with all the family, for the wilds of British Columbia, which is far to the north of here. But there was some accident, and they were wrecked near Mount Shasta. You have heard of that mountain. It is far to the north. The plague broke out amongst them, and this boy of 11 was the only survivor. For 8 years he was alone, wandering over a deserted land, and looking vainly for his own kind. And at last, traveling south, he picked up with us, the Santa Rosans. But I am ahead of my story. When the great exodus from the cities around San Francisco Bay began, and while the telephones were still working, I talked with my brother. I told him this flight from the cities was insanity, that there were no symptoms of the plague in me, and that the thing for us to do was to isolate ourselves and our relatives in some safe place. We decided on the chemistry building at the university, and we planned to lay in a supply of provisions, and by force of arms to prevent any other persons from forcing their presence upon us, after we had retired to our refuge. All this being arranged, my brother begged me to stay in my own house for at least 24 hours more, on the chance of the plague developing in me. To this I agreed, and he promised to come for me next day. We talked on over the details of the provisioning and the defending of the chemistry building until the telephone died. It died in the midst of our conversation. That evening there were no electric lights, and I was alone in my house in the darkness. No more newspapers were being printed, so I had no knowledge of what was taking place outside. I heard sounds of rioting and of pistol shots, and from my windows I could see the glare of the sky of some conflagration in the direction of Oakland. It was a night of terror. I did not sleep a wink. A man, why and how I do not know, was killed on the sidewalk in front of the house. I heard the rapid reports of an automatic pistol, and a few minutes later the wounded wretch crawled up to my door, moaning and crying out for help. Arming myself with 2 automatics, I went to him. By the light of a match I ascertained that while he was dying of the bullet wounds, at the same time the plague was on him. I fled indoors, whence I heard him moan and cry out for half an hour longer. In the morning my brother came to me. I had gathered into a handbag what things of value I purposed taking, but when I saw his face, I knew that he would never accompany me to the chemistry building. The plague was on him. He intended shaking my hand, but I went back hurriedly before him. "Look at yourself in the mirror," I commanded. He did so, and at sight of his scarlet face, the colour deepening as he looked at it, he sank down nervelessly in a chair. "My God," he said, "I've got it. Don't come near me. I am a dead man." Then the convulsions seized him. He was 2 hours in dying, and he was conscious to the last, complaining about the coldness and loss of sensation in his feet, his calves, his thighs, until at last it was his heart, and he died. That was the way the Scarlet Death slew. I caught up my handbag and fled. The sights in the streets were terrible. One stumbled on bodies everywhere. Some were not yet dead, and even as you looked you saw men sink down with the death fastened upon them. There were numerous fires burning in Berkeley, while Oakland and San Francisco were apparently being swept by vast conflagrations. The smoke of the burning filled the heavens, so that the midday was as a gloomy twilight, and in the shifts of wind sometimes the sun shone through dimly, a dull red orb. Truly, my grandsons, it was like the last days of the end of the world. There were numerous stalled motor cars, showing that the gasoline and the engine supplies of the garages had given out. I remember one such car. A man and a woman lay back dead in the seats, and on the pavement near it were 2 more women and a child. Strange and terrible sights there were on every hand. People slipped by silently, furtively, like ghosts. White-faced women carrying infants in their arms, fathers leading children by the hand, singly and in couples and in families, all fleeing out of the city of death. Some carried supplies of food, others blankets and valuables, and there were many who carried nothing. There was a grocery store, a place where food was sold. The man to whom it belonged, I knew him well. A quiet, sober, but stupid and obstinate fellow was defending it. The windows and doors had been broken in, but he, inside, hiding behind a counter, was discharging his pistol at a number of men on the sidewalk who were breaking in. In the entrance were several bodies, of men, I decided, whom he had killed earlier in the day. Even as I looked on from a distance, I saw one of the robbers break the windows of the adjoining store, a place where shoes were sold, and deliberately set fire to it. I did not go to the groceryman's assistance. The time for such acts had already passed. Civilization was crumbling, and it was each for himself. End of Section 3.